Something shifted quietly in the NFL and most people missed it, not because it was important, but because it didn't come with a press conference or a headline big enough to match what it actually meant. For months, one young quarterback found himself at the center of chaos. Not just pressure on the field, but tension off it. Questions about trust, questions about protection, questions about whether the situation around him was ever designed for him to succeed in the first place. Every week added another layer, another distraction, another test. And then, late in the season, the league stepped in. Not with words, not with explanations, but with action. A ruling that didn't erase what happened, but signaled that something had gone too far. For some fans, it felt like overdue accountability. For others, it felt like confirmation that the situation had been mishandled all along. Either way, it sent a message that couldn't be ignored. Because this wasn't just about one hit. It was about a season that never felt normal, about a quarterback who kept taking shots, physically and figuratively, while the conversation around him spiraled. About a franchise already drowning in uncertainty, now facing even harder questions about leadership, direction, and trust. And while the league closed the book on one incident, Cleveland quietly opened another chapter. Coaching uncertainty, interviews piling up, big names circling, but hesitating, all while the future of the quarterback position remains unresolved. So the real question isn't whether justice was served. It's whether this moment changes anything at all. Because once you see how everything connects, the hits, the ruling, the coaching chaos, you realize this story isn't over. It's just entering its most important phase yet. From the very start, nothing about this season felt settled. Before the first snap even mattered, questions were already forming, not about ability, not about preparation, but about opportunity. Why the reps weren't consistent, why the trust felt conditional, why the margin for error seemed thinner here than anywhere else. For a young quarterback trying to establish himself, stability is everything. And that was the one thing he never truly had. Reports and on-field patterns suggested he was constantly operating under a microscope, every practice rep dissected, every series judged harsher than the last. When mistakes happened, the response felt immediate. When progress showed, it rarely bought patience. Fans noticed, analysts tiptoed around it, and the noise only grew louder as the weeks went on. Then came the off-field distractions. Not scandals in the traditional sense, but disruptions that pull focus whether you want them to or not. Situations that demand attention when all a quarterback wants to do is prepare. It's been said those moments weighed heavily, adding pressure to an environment already stretched thin. None of it showed up in box scores, but all of it mattered. And when game days arrived, the pressure followed him onto the field. Defenses didn't treat him like a developing player. They treated him like a target. Late contact, extra shoves, hits that made fans wince and rewind the broadcast. Some flagged, some ignored, each one adding to the sense that he was being tested in ways that went beyond normal football punishment. To his credit, he kept getting back up. There were growing pains, no question, timing issues, missed opportunities, drives that stalled before they ever had a chance to breathe. But there was also composure, poise under stress, a refusal to spiral even when things around him felt unstable. That's what made this season so frustrating for those watching closely. Because the conversation kept drifting away from football, it became about management, about coaching decisions, about whether the situation itself was working against the player it was supposed to develop. None of that was ever confirmed, but it didn't need to be for doubt to take hold. And as the season wore on, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a tough rookie year. It was a constant test of endurance. And that pressure was building towards something the league could no longer ignore. As the weeks passed, the frustration shifted from subtle to impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about stalled drives or missed reads anymore. It was about how often the quarterback was getting hit and how those hits were happening. Fans started rewinding plays. Slow-motion clips circulated online. Comment sections filled with the same question over and over. Why does it feel like he's taking punishment that others are? Some of it was football. Quarterbacks get hit. That's the job. But some of it felt different. Late contact. Extra force. Moments where the whistle had clearly blown, yet the hit still came. And when flags didn't follow, the irritation grew louder. Opposing defenses seemed to test the limits, daring officials to step in. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. Each no call added to the belief that this quarterback wasn't being afforded the same margin of protection the league claims to prioritize. Whether that belief was fully fair or not didn't matter anymore. Perception had already taken over. What made it worse was timing. These weren't isolated moments in blowout games. They came in tight situations when momentum mattered. A hit on first down that turned confidence into hesitation. A shot after a release that changed how quickly the pocket collapsed. The kind of contact that doesn't show up in stat lines but alters how a player moves, thinks, and reacts. Still, he didn't lash out. No dramatic gestures, no public complaints, no sideline confrontations that would have been easy to justify. He absorbed it all quietly, even as fans grew increasingly vocal on his behalf. That restraint earned respect in some circles and concern in others. Because silence can be misread. To some, it looked like toughness. To others, it looked like a young quarterback being tested to see how much he could take before breaking. And that's where the tone around the league began to shift. Analysts stopped brushing it off as rookie treatment. Former players started speaking up. The conversation moved from performance to protection. And eventually, the league had no choice but to notice. Not because of one viral clip, not because of one bad call, but because the pattern was becoming too loud to ignore. The hits weren't just physical anymore. They were symbolic. And once symbolism enters the picture, the NFL tends to respond, not to fix the past, but to control what happens next. Which brings us to the play that finally forced the league's hand. It didn't happen in a primetime spotlight or a must-win playoff game. It happened quietly, late in the season, when most people had already written Cleveland off. But sometimes, the moments that matter most arrive when attention is lowest. Midway through the game, the pocket collapsed fast. The quarterback did what he was supposed to do, read quickly, release the ball, avoid the rush. The pass was out. The play was effectively over. And then the hit came anyway. Hard, late, unnecessary. The stadium reacted instantly, not with surprise but with frustration. It felt familiar. Another shot that didn't need to happen. Another moment that forced everyone watching to ask the same question they'd been asking all season. How much more is this guy supposed to take? This time, though, the flag came out. Roughing the passer. 15 yards. Automatic first down. A small swing on the scoreboard, but a massive shift in tone. Because this wasn't just a call in real time. This one lingered. Analysts replayed it. Fans clipped it. And more importantly, the league reviewed it. According to the rulebook, hits like that carry consequences beyond the field. Fines, accountability, a paper trail that follows defenders and, more importantly, alerts teams that the NFL is watching closely now. And that's exactly what happened. Days later, the league finalized its ruling. The defender involved was fined. Not a record-breaking amount, not a suspension, but enough to matter, enough to make a point, enough to quietly confirm that the hit crossed a line. That's why this moment mattered more than the yardage gained. Because fines aren't about punishment alone. They're about precedent. They tell players what won't be tolerated moving forward. And they tell teams, especially those with young quarterbacks, that the league is paying attention. For fans who felt the quarterback had been taking unnecessary punishment all season, it felt like validation. Not justice in the dramatic sense, but acknowledgement. Proof that the concern wasn't imagined. But the timing raised an even bigger question. Why now? Why at the end of the season, after so much had already happened? Was this the league correcting course, or quietly trying to reset expectations before something worse occurred? Whatever the reason, the message was clear. The tone had changed. And once the league changes tone, everything around the situation starts to shift with it. On paper, the ruling didn't seem dramatic. A fine, a line item in the league's weekly accountability report. Something most fans scroll past without a second thought. But in this case, the meaning carried far more weight than the number attached to it. Because the NFL doesn't fine players just to fine them. Every fine is a signal. It tells defenders what the league expects going forward. It tells officials how closely certain situations are being monitored. And it tells teams, especially those with young quarterbacks, that the league is watching how their players are treated on the field. That's why this one stood out. This wasn't a repeat offender. It wasn't a nationally televised controversy. It wasn't tied to a massive brawl or an obvious meltdown. It was a single hit, late in a lost season, involving a quarterback many had already stopped talking about. And yet the league still acted. To some fans, it felt overdue, almost like a quiet acknowledgement that things had gone unchecked for too long. Not an apology, not an admission, just a subtle correction, a way of saying this is where the line is. Others saw it differently. They questioned why it took until now, why similar hits earlier in the season didn't draw the same response, why consistency still feels elusive when it comes to protecting quarterbacks who don't carry superstar status yet. That debate matters because perception shapes reality in this league. If players believe certain quarterbacks are fair game, behavior changes. If defenders believe the league will step in, hesitation follows. And if teams believe their quarterback is finally being protected, it changes how they plan, how they call games, and how aggressively they develop talent. That's the ripple effect most people miss. This fine wasn't about erasing what already happened. It was about controlling what happens next, about preventing escalation, about setting expectations before frustration turns into something uglier. And while fans were still debating whether this counted as justice, Cleveland was dealing with a much bigger problem. Because accountability on the field doesn't fix instability off it. The fine closed one conversation, but it opened another, one that centers on leadership, direction, and whether this organization truly knows what it's doing with the most important position in football. And once that question is asked, it doesn't go away quietly, especially with a head coaching search already spiraling into uncertainty. That's where this story starts to shift from league discipline to organizational chaos. And that might be the most important part of all. As soon as the fine was announced, the conversation shifted, but not in the way Cleveland probably hoped. Because while the league appeared to draw a line on player safety, fans immediately started asking a different question. What about everything else? For weeks, there had been quiet frustration building around how the quarterback was being handled internally. Nothing officially confirmed. No press conference blow-ups. Just patterns that were hard to ignore if you were paying close attention. The inconsistent reps. The short leash during games. The play calling that felt conservative one moment, then suddenly reckless the next. It's been said by people close to the situation that trust never fully settled in, that every mistake felt amplified, that development and evaluation were happening at the same time, which is a dangerous mix for any young quarterback. Again, none of this was ever stated outright, but fans don't need confirmation to sense tension. And tension has a way of showing itself. When a quarterback takes repeated hits and doesn't get rhythm plays to settle in, people notice. When protection breaks down and adjustments feel slow, people notice. When confidence seems fragile one week and restrained the next, people notice. That's where speculation filled the gap. Some believed the coaching staff never truly committed to him. Others felt he was being asked to survive instead of grow. And once that narrative takes hold, every decision is reinterpreted through that lens. A conservative call becomes distrust. A benching becomes a message. A short series becomes a statement. Fair or not, that's how NFL stories spiral. What made it worse was timing. The fine from the league suggested protection was finally being taken seriously, yet questions about internal support remained unanswered. That disconnect only added fuel to the fire. Because if the league is stepping in, fans expect the team to step up. Instead, Cleveland drifted into uncertainty. The season ended. The record spoke for itself. And suddenly, the focus wasn't on fixes, it was on futures, on whether the coaching staff would even survive, on whether the quarterback would enter the next season with clarity or more questions. That's the danger of unresolved tension. It doesn't explode right away. It lingers, it leaks, and eventually it forces decisions whether an organization is ready or not. And in Cleveland's case, those decisions arrived faster than anyone expected. Because once the season ended, the coaching conversation didn't just heat up. It cracked wide open. Once the season officially ended, Cleveland didn't ease into change. They plunged straight into it. Interviews were requested. Names started circulating. And before long, it felt like the Browns were talking to everyone without giving anyone a clear sense of direction. That's when people around the league started raising eyebrows. A wide coaching search isn't unusual on its own, but when it stretches on, expands rapidly, and lacks a clear favorite, it sends a message. Either the organization is being extremely thorough, or it doesn't know what it actually wants. Right now, Cleveland looks like the second option. Reports suggest the Browns have been casting one of the widest nets in the league. Coordinators, former head coaches, long shots, familiar faces, new ideas, it's all on the table. And while that might sound proactive, it also creates a perception problem. Top coaching candidates want clarity. They want to know who their quarterback will be. They want to know how much control they'll have. They want to know if ownership and the front office are aligned. And that's where Cleveland keeps running into trouble. From the outside, it's hard to tell what the plan actually is. Is this a rebuild, a quick turnaround, a reset with patience, or a win-now mandate? Without answers, interest cools. Even respected names start listening but hesitating. That hesitation is telling. Because the Browns don't lack resources. They don't lack talent. What they lack is confidence from the people they're trying to hire. And confidence is everything in these negotiations. Coaches don't want to walk into uncertainty unless they're empowered to fix it. The quarterback situation plays a massive role here. Any coach considering Cleveland knows that how this team handles its young quarterback will define their tenure. If development is rushed or politicized, it becomes a career risk. If trust is unstable, the margin for error disappears. That's why some candidates are reportedly prioritizing other teams, not because Cleveland is impossible, but because it's unclear. And uncertainty is the one thing elite coaches avoid. So now the Browns are stuck in a familiar place, interviewing aggressively, waiting anxiously, hoping the right answer reveals itself, all while fans grow more uneasy and players watch closely. Because the longer this drags on, the louder the message becomes. Cleveland isn't just searching for a coach. It's searching for direction. And until it finds that, every other issue, quarterback development, protection, accountability, remains unresolved. Which is exactly why one unexpected name entering the conversation has people paying attention again. Because sometimes, uncertainty invites bold ideas. Then a familiar name surfaced, and the tone shifted instantly. Not because a deal was imminent, not because anything was confirmed, but because John Harbaugh entering the conversation forces reality checks across the league. When a coach of that stature even listens, it tells you Cleveland is serious about changing something. Still, listening isn't the same as committing. From everything being said around league circles, Harbaugh's interest, if it exists at all, comes with conditions, and they're not unreasonable. He would want stability, alignment between ownership and the front office, and above all, clarity at quarterback. Not just talent, but a real plan. That's the sticking point. Because right now, Cleveland doesn't project certainty. It projects possibility mixed with hesitation. And for a veteran coach who values structure and trust, that's a dangerous combination. You don't walk into a situation like that unless you're convinced you'll be empowered to shape it. That's why analysts have pointed out that other teams feel more ready. Organizations with cleaner quarterback outlooks, clearer timelines, less internal noise. It's not about Cleveland lacking resources. It's about Cleveland lacking a unified message. And yet, the fact that Harbaugh is even being discussed matters. It raises the stakes of the entire search. Suddenly, this isn't just about filling a vacancy. It's about proving to respected leaders that Cleveland is worth the risk, that this isn't another short-term fix or experimental reset destined to fail. If the Browns can't convince someone like Harbaugh or someone of similar caliber that they have a coherent plan, the consequences are obvious. The search drags on. The roster waits. The quarterback situation stays unresolved, and the same cycle threatens to repeat. But if they can, then everything changes. Because hearing a coach of that level instantly stabilizes perception. It signals seriousness. It buys patience, and it forces accountability at every level of the organization. That's why this moment feels so pivotal. The league isn't watching to see who Cleveland hires. They're watching to see why that coach says yes. And buried inside that answer is the truth about how this franchise views its quarterback, its future, and the lessons it may, or may not, have learned from this season. Whatever happens next won't just define a coaching search. It will define whether Cleveland finally breaks the cycle or slides right back into it. So now the season is over, the fine has been issued, and the noise has shifted. But the most important questions are still hanging in the air. Because what happened wasn't just about one hit, one ruling, or one frustrating year. It was about how quickly situations can spiral when stability disappears. For some fans, the league's decision felt like long overdue acknowledgement. Not a dramatic punishment, not a headline-grabbing move, but a signal. A quiet way of saying that certain things crossed a line and that the pattern mattered. In that sense, it felt like justice, or at least the closest version of it the NFL ever offers. But justice doesn't fix systems. It doesn't rebuild trust between a quarterback and a coaching staff. It doesn't answer questions about development or commitment. And it doesn't guarantee that next season will look any different than the last. That's where the uncertainty really lives. Because Cleveland is standing at a familiar crossroads again. A young quarterback whose future is still unclear. A coaching search that feels more reactive than confident. And an organization trying to convince the league and itself that it finally knows what it's doing. This fine may have closed one chapter, but it opened another. One where expectations are sharper, where excuses carry less weight, and where every decision moving forward will be judged against what just happened. If the Browns get this next step right, if they bring in leadership with a clear plan, real alignment, and patience, this season could end up being a painful but necessary turning point. The moment they realized what wasn't working and chose to change it. But if they do, then this fine becomes just another footnote, another moment fans point back to and say, that's when we should have known. Another missed opportunity buried in a long history of almosts and what-ifs. That's the reality now. Because in the NFL, accountability without follow-through doesn't mean much, and protection without trust doesn't last. What matters is what happens next, who gets hired, how the quarterback is supported, and whether the organization finally commits to a direction instead of reacting to pressure. So the real question isn't whether justice was served. It's whether this moment finally forces change. Because if it doesn't, then nothing that happened this season truly mattered at all.